It took nearly 4 days for the officer at the center of George Floyd's death to be charged. Protesters say that was too long, but Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman disagrees.
I must say that this case has moved with extraordinary speed. This conduct, this criminal action, took place on Monday evening, May 25th, Memorial Day. I'm speaking to you at 1 o'clock on Friday, May 29th. That's less than 4 days. That's extraordinary. This is by far the fastest we've ever charged a police officer.
Joining me now, NBC News and MSNBC legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirschner. Glenn, it has been a long time. Wonderful to have you on News Now. First, what do you think about the time it took here to arrest Chauvin?
Allison, great to see you again. And, you know, 4 days does seem like the authorities moved fairly quickly. However, what I'll say is that in my 22 years as a homicide prosecutor, we would often review, approve, and issue arrest warrants in murder cases within hours of the murder if the evidence was clear and indisputable with respect to homicide liability. What I see on these tapes makes it look like it is clear and indisputable when you have one officer kneeling on the neck of somebody who's already in handcuffs, who's already incapacitated by 4 officers applying restraint. And when that officer keeps the knee on the neck of the suspect for 6 minutes until he loses consciousness and another 3 minutes after that, Allison, that seems like a case where there could have been an arrest warrant issued immediately upon reviewing that videotape.
Glenn, I want to ask you about the charges, but since we're talking about the video, I want to stay on that for a minute because so many of us looked at it and thought, oh my goodness, this is so obvious here. But you're talking about it in terms of charges. But how about in terms of prosecution? Because we know this is not the first time we've had a case where there has been video. What do you say to people who think this should be easy to prosecute here? Look what happened in that video.
First of all, no case is a sure thing. No case is easy to prosecute. Take it from me because I've lost plenty of cases over my career. And particularly when you are prosecuting a police officer. You know, the police officer will argue that he was in fear for his life. He was protecting the community. And, you know, there are some jurors who might be sitting in that jury box who are amenable to those kind of arguments. However, when you have a case of clear excessive force by police officers causing the death of a citizen that they are sworn to protect, this is a case that had to be brought, should have been brought even more promptly than it was. And like I say, Allison, nothing is a sure thing, but I think on the evidence, it will prove to be a very compelling case at trial.
All right, Glenn, so let's talk about the 2 charges here, third-degree murder and manslaughter. Can you explain those for those of us who aren't as familiar with the law as you are?
Sure. First of all, it's not unusual to charge in the alternative. That means even though there's only one homicide, it's not unusual for prosecutors to bring 2 different homicide charges because there are different elements that go into proving a manslaughter versus a third-degree murder. So a third-degree murder under the laws of Minnesota carries with it up to 25 years in prison, and it is essentially a homicide in which the defendant, the suspect, doesn't necessarily have to intend to kill the victim, but he has to act in an eminently dangerous way that demonstrates an extreme disregard for human life. So it's not like an intentional first-degree premeditated murder. It is really this extreme level of recklessness and disregard for human life. So that is the more serious of the 2 charges. The manslaughter, Allison, is much easier to prove because it really is a gross negligence standard. If you acted in a way that was grossly negligent and as a result of your negligent conduct somebody died, that will serve as manslaughter liability. That only carries a 15-year maximum prison term under Minnesota law. So there are two different charges that will be brought. But let me tell you, Allison, I don't think the charging is necessarily over, because that's the government's opening salvo. However, they can investigate the case, and they can ultimately indict the officer or officers for a higher level of homicide if the evidence as it develops supports those greater charges.
Glenn, Floyd's family here wanted first-degree murder charges. Why do you think we saw this third-degree charge instead?
Well, first of all, as I say, it's an opening salvo, but we have to see what all of the evidence shows. First-degree murder is typically a murder that involves premeditation and deliberation. Now, premeditation is forming a design to kill another person. It doesn't mean you have to, intend to kill that person and put your plans in place for days and weeks. It can be as quick as a couple of minutes that you engage in premeditation. And then deliberation, which is turning your intent to kill over in your mind, giving it a second thought, and deciding to do it, can also take place very quickly. But premeditation and deliberation, those are states of mind that we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a murder case. And even in the more run-of-the-mill, the more routine murder case not involving a police officer, those are very high burdens for prosecutors to prove. We have to see where the evidence lays out, but it may be that they end up bumping this up from a third-degree murder to a second-degree murder. But I am glad that even after a 4-day delay, they have brought charges against the officer who seems to be most culpable. However, there certainly seems to be criminal culpability with those other officers who were applying pressure until Mr. Floyd was dead.
Yeah, Glenn, let me ask you about that. As you said, there were 3 other officers involved in this incident. Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman says he does anticipate charges. What do you think prosecutors might look at there?
I think it really depends on exactly what the medical examiner rules with respect to the cause and manner of death. That will determine, in part, the level of culpability and the appropriate charges that could be brought against the other officers who were involved in restraint, while the main offender, it looks like Officer Chauvin, had his knee on the neck of George Floyd until he stopped moving, and even thereafter until he was dead. So those officers who were applying restraint, they have a duty of care to Mr. Floyd as well. And it's a duty to protect Mr. Floyd's life, not assist Officer Chauvin in ending Mr. Floyd's life.
Glenn Kirschner, always appreciate your legal expertise, but we could really use it in times like this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison.
Twitter putting another label on one of President Trump's tweets, this time a warning on this tweet about the Minneapolis protests. The president tweeting, quote, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty and we will assume control, but when the looting starts, the shooting starts." NBC News senior media reporter Dylan Byers joining us now. And Dylan, what happened here with President Trump's tweet? How is Twitter explaining this particular label?
Sure. Well, for Twitter, the calculation here is they have a policy, and one of those policies is that they don't condone tweets promoting violence. Normally, if any random Twitter user, even yourself or myself, were to post a tweet promoting violence, they would take that tweet down. They might even go further into looking at whether or not they should ban the user, him or herself. In this case, when you're talking about the president of the United States or any government official or major political figure, they have made the judgment that it is so politically newsworthy and important for people to be able to see that tweet and talk about that tweet and discuss that tweet. It's violence. They hide it, and then they give you the option to click on it. Now, Twitter is sort of locked in a little bit of a sort of push and pull with the White House right now, because what the White House then did is it went out from the official White House account and tweeted out the same language, forcing Twitter to put yet another disclaimer on that tweet. And this is sort of a back and forth and a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole that we might see play out well into next week.
Dylan, there is some history to the last part of the tweet when the president says, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. For our viewers who aren't familiar with it, could you give us some of the background?
Yeah, absolutely. So it dates back to a statement that was made by the Walter Headley, the chief of police in Miami back in 1967. And in that same statement, he effectively said that they didn't mind being accused of police brutality. It was then echoed by the segregationist George Wallace in 1968, 1 year later. And I think it's telling that that is the quote that the president cited, because things are starting to feel a lot like 1968 right now in America with what we see in Minneapolis and with the, with what happened in Minneapolis. So, the White House is now trying to claim that the president wasn't promoting violence, that he was condemning violence. It's a very hard case to make when you're quoting segregationists.
Yeah, sure is. Dylan Byers, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.